Good morning, everyone from San Francisco. I'm Philip Yun, CEO and President of World Affairs and your host. We hope you had a restful evening or are having a good day so far, depending on where you may be around the world. We're on day 3 of the Global Philanthropy Forum. And today we look ahead and talk about concrete actions to deal with climate change and what we can do to make these solutions and ideas that we'll be discussing better and more effective. So it's my great pleasure to introduce this next panel. We start with one of the great environmentalists of our time, Bill McKibben. Bill is in conversation with our session's host, Joanna Messing, who is the executive director of the Growald Family Foundation. So let's go to it. Now we turn to Joanna to talk about clean energy and grassroots power with Bill McKibben. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Joanna Messing. I'm the executive director of the Growald Family Fund, a venture philanthropy fund that's catalyzing efforts towards the rapid transition to a clean energy future. We work internationally to support seed and early stage leaders and organizations to scale their visions. I'm really thrilled to welcome you all into a conversation with my fellow traveler, Bill McKibben, founder of the global grassroots climate campaign 350.org. We know him as an author of such seminal books as The End of Nature, which is regarded as the first book written for a general audience about climate change. He's also recently started a new newsletter, The Climate Crisis, at The New Yorker. He's a professor serving at Middlebury College. He has 19 honorary degrees, which is really impressive. And basically, he's organized for climate action everywhere. In every continent, he's played a leading role in launching the opposition to big oil pipeline projects, launching the fossil fuel divestment campaign, which has become the biggest anti-corporate campaign in history, with endowments worth more than 15 trillion stepping back from oil, gas, and coal. It's really hard to quantify the immense impact that Bill's work has had on people and on our planet. But as a climate philanthropist who's had the honor of working with Bill and 350, I've been able to see the impact of his work on the ground and on our thinking. In this conversation, I'm hoping we can discuss some of the hard-won lessons that Bill's learned from his decades of climate activism and reflect together on some of the opportunities in climate philanthropy to guide our community's thinking and priorities, particularly in this moment of crisis. So, Bill, if we go back to the beginning, back in 2010, we at Growald and our sister foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, gave a seed grant to this tiny think tank in London, Carbon Tracker, which had the audacious idea that climate change might actually impact markets, and introduced this concept of the carbon bubble and stranded assets. At the time, this was absolutely radical, but you saw something in this, and your article in the Rolling Stone and your work with 350 helped take that idea and spread it like wildfire through the world. So I would just love to hear, when you reflect back on that, what are some of the lessons that you take away, particularly around inside and outside strategy, the role of funders in supporting that type of unusual collaboration and partnership? I'd love to just hear some reflections from you.
Sure. Joanna, first of all, what a pleasure to get to talk with you and to get to see you on the screen, which is how we see people these days. I'm, as you can tell, I'm in my car, my electric vehicle, because that's what happens with the rural internet in America. But it's a pleasure to join you all. That was an interesting story, and I'm kind of glad you brought it up. And I'm also really glad that you gave some money to Carbon Tracker early on. They published a small report in 2012, and it just laid out what to me was the extremely interesting fact that the fossil fuel industry, the big oil, coal, gas companies, had in their reserves about 5 times as much carbon as any scientist thought we could safely burn. And once you read that, then you sort of understood companies like Exxon in a new light as kind of rogue companies who, if their business plan was carried out, the end to this story was already written. The only other person I know who actually read that report when it first came out was my dear friend Naomi Klein. And the two of us were talking about it. It both struck us, both for the same reason. And we both had the same initial thought. You know, we'd been in college during the anti-apartheid divestment campaigns. And both of us thought that there was something comparable here, that was maybe the last time that we had true rogue companies operating way outside the bounds of what should be considered normal. And so we wondered if a divestment campaign of the same sort might be workable. I wrote that piece for Rolling Stone, and it went extremely viral because it had, this new data in it. And other people, I was able to help other people share my sense of kind of shock at what we were learning, and then set out to do this organizing campaign. And we did it. With my colleagues at 350, we within a couple of months had set up this series of events across America. I think we did 30 cities, 29 cities in 30 days. And we were doing 3,000 or 4,000 people a night, big arenas. It was harrowing, but by the time we were done, and it was a good show, you can actually see the video at Do the Math. If you just Google Do the Math YouTube, by the time we were done, there were 400 college campuses in America that had divestment campaigns underway. So this had all happened in the space of less than a year. And before the next year was out, we'd done the same thing around Australia and New Zealand, and then around Europe, and had massive divestment campaigns going in all these places. 10 years later, fast forward, as you say, this has become a huge operation. We're at closing in on $15 trillion in endowments. More to the point, it's making a huge impact in lessening the political power of these companies. Jim Cramer, America's favorite stock picker, who yells at people every night about what stocks to pick on television, devoted a night in January to saying no one should buy oil company stocks anymore because the divestment movement had just gotten too big around the world and there was never going to be money made in them again. Too many funds had to put them aside. So that, I think, has been well worth the effort. It's one of the things I've worked on this last decade, and it's a perfect example of this kind of synthesis of data, real expertise, ability to take that and translate it into language and imagery that everyone can understand, and then just hardcore organizing. But the thing about it that was maybe best was that my premise going in was most people don't have a coal mine or a pipeline or something in their backyard, but everybody's close to a pot of money at their college, at their church, at their local pension fund. So this is a way for everybody to get in this fight. And so it has been. Once we started that initial kickoff of organizing, it's mostly been just people taking it on in thousands and thousands and thousands of different places on their own and making it their own, including, of course, in the world of philanthropy, where people like Wallace Global have done an amazing job of trying to convince other foundations to not put their money where their mouth isn't, or whatever the right way of phrasing it would be. But huge shout out to everybody who's been worked on that. It's been enormously helpful. And I'll add, one of the signal moments in the entire thing were when the Rockefeller philanthropies, heir to the world's biggest oil fortune, original oil fortune, divested their holdings in fossil fuel. That was 2 or 3 years in, and it was a huge and important part of that story.
Thank you. I mean, I feel like there's so many lessons from this for philanthropy today, thinking about how we de-risk new ideas by supporting early stage organizations or research, but also about how we help scale things quickly and boldly. And then also how we as foundations act ourselves with our own endowments and our own voices. And so it's really, I feel like, a unique example within the interaction of philanthropy, civil society, and movements. And I mean, I've been reflecting a lot, as I'm sure most people are, about how do we need to change our philanthropic strategy? What's the right scale and scope of action right now in this time of crisis, particularly as we look internationally? And I'd be really curious to hear your lessons or reflections or things that you might want philanthropists in the audience to be considering now based on these lessons.
Well, I got to say, my experience of philanthropy is limited. I was on the board for a number of years of the Schuman Foundation with Bill Moyers at its head. And so I got to, but it was a very anomalous operation. I got to watch as proposals came in, and the Schuman brothers, whose money it was, would invariably say, well, that sounds like a great idea. Let's give them twice as much as they've asked for. And I in a certain way, I came to think that was a smart strategy, to make some bets and then just, bet on people and let them at it. The thing about climate change, and this may be sort of unique to climate change, the thing to understand about it, as you know better than anybody, is that it really is the first time-limited problem that we've ever faced. It's not like the other political problems that we deal with, where you get to come back every few years and nibble a little bit more and get a little further along. If we don't solve it very soon, and the IPCC has indicated that very soon means the next decade, then we won't solve it. We will have gone past tipping points from which there is no return. So that characteristic of, if we had 75 years to deal with it, the answer to how to fund and organize and everything would be very different. But since we don't, it argues for a lot of kind of Hail Mary passes, a lot of really pushing super hard in a super short period of time. If you're interested in climate change, the money, your money turns to dust after 2030 or 2035 or something like that, because the problem will by then either have been addressed to some degree or will have reached the point of unaddressability.
I completely agree with that. And I do think there's some really bold examples of what philanthropists have been doing. We're seeing more spend down foundations, we're seeing innovative financing, and I certainly encourage foundations to look into that. One of the things that I think is also a challenge with this moment is finding hope and optimism and seeing opportunity in on what often seems very bleak. And so I'm curious and would love to hear where you're finding hope and seeing opportunity right now.
Well, I'm hopeful. I actually, I'm not always hopeful, Joanne. The name of the book that I wrote about this 30 years ago was, had the cheerful title, "The End of Nature." Okay, so I'm no Pollyanna about where we are. But, when we started 350.org now just over 10 years ago, that was the first iteration of a global climate movement. That was it. When we did our first day of action in 2009, and we had 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries, it was the first fluorescence of any kind of global, coming together around this. Most of those 5,200 demonstrations were small, 100 people here and there, but in every part of the world. Now, so beautiful to watch so many people piling in. Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement with the Green New Deal. Most beautiful of all, high school and junior high school students around the world. Everybody knows Greta Thunberg, and she is wonderful, and I love working with her. But there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs and 10 million followers of these people scattered all over the world. And it is tilting now public opinion in a powerful way. The combination of that hope and the very raw fear that comes with watching, fire overtake the West Coast and watching 5 hurricanes dance across the Atlantic at the same time, and on and on and on. Those two things have opened a window for public opinion to shift in powerful ways. And over the last 10 years, the engineers have done a good enough job of dropping the cost of sun and wind that if we wanted to, we could make rapid and pretty dramatic progress. The stumbling block remains the power of the fossil fuel industry, its ability to prevent change from happening, as you know better than anyone from your remarkable work on coal in particular all over the world, for which one is deeply grateful. But we're closer because we've built these movements to having a counterbalancing power there. And so, look, we've lost 30 years in this fight. That means we have to cram the work of 4 decades into 1 decade. I don't know whether it can be done, but I know it has to be done. And so I'm really glad that there's a movement there to try to get it done.
Yeah, I'm also so inspired by the people that we keep meeting, especially leaders from emerging economies, non-traditional environmentalists. And we're really thinking about how we find new leaders, find new organizations, support new voices and approaches. And I'm curious about what you're thinking in terms of how do we nurture that next generation at speed and scale that don't have the time to build a career over 10, 20 years and emerge as a leader in their 40s or 50s, but are really emerging as leaders now in their teens and early 20s. And 350 has been absolutely amazing at finding and cultivating some of those young leaders. What are your thoughts on how we speed that up and really amplify the support of new leaders?
Well, I mean, that's the right question. And one of the things is when there's a fight going on, when people are engaged in a big fight, that's when you learn, that's when things really coalesce. So the divestment movement, to go back to that, was the perfect school. Almost all the people who were running the Sunrise Movement and brought forth the Green New Deal, they cut their teeth on divestment campaigns on college campuses. It may have been the biggest yield of that entire campaign. So Varshini Prakash, who runs the Sunrise Movement, divested UMass Amherst before she did anything else. And that's a kind of, I mean, I think when you can get fights underway, it really helps. It's wonderful to watch young people coming in. It's wonderful and really powerful to see the emerging leadership at the absolute front of this work of indigenous people around the world, as you know, in every continent, and of kind of frontline communities. I'm going to say something that you'll find odd. I think the next interesting organizing challenge may not be with young people, it may be with old people. Yeah. And I have I think maybe that's where I'm going to be putting a lot of my efforts in the next few years. I think we have a huge pool of underutilized potential activists, and that figuring out how to bring them into this fight as backup for young people around the world may be really, really a crucial determinant. I'm not completely sure how to do that, but I've got some ideas, and it's what I'm working on next. So if anybody wants to help, be in touch.
That's interesting. I know my mom will want to be engaged in that for sure. And so we only have 2 minutes left, but I'm so grateful to you and for our conversations over the years and the work of 350. And I feel like the message that you're sending is really that we as philanthropy need to be acting boldly now, and that there are many different engagement points, from working with youth to working with elderly people to working in the US to working internationally on the inside or the outside, but that really the priority is acting and acting boldly, and not being afraid to take some risks, because we as philanthropy, as a sector, are uniquely able to take risks. Are there any closing words that you would have?
I really do want to thank everybody who's been part of this fight. The last decade has been very, very interesting. And and it will have been worth it all the trips to jail, all the whatever, if it sets us up for this coming decade. We're going to have to be continue to work hard from the outside, and we're going to need a good inside game too, as countries and institutions begin actually to bend in the right direction. But to me, always the key is more organizing. That's what tilts the scales. And you can have the best set of policy plans in the world, and really we've had them for a very long time. It's not been really mysterious about what we needed to do. But until we build that organizing muscle, until we're able to strike a little bit of fear into the powers that be, either that or offer them the real reward of big backing, it's difficult to get change at the scale we need. So I continue to tell people the same thing. I always tell them that, what should I do about climate change? You're not going to solve it at this point, one Tesla at a time, one vegan dinner at a time. The most important thing an individual can do, and this goes, I think, for foundations too, is be a little less of an individual. Join together with others in movements big enough to make a difference. And we've never needed it more.
Thank you so much, Bill. I completely agree. So unfortunately, this is the end, and the next session, Collective Action, Holding Governments Accountable, will begin after a short break at 8:30. Thanks so much to the Global Philanthropy Forum for hosting us, and please send questions or comments afterwards. We would be happy to continue this conversation on the platform.
Thank you again, Joanna.
Thank you, Bill.